Hello everyone. We have a special guest teacher today, Paddy D. He's ready to come and teach you all about the justice system. Ain't that right? Want to say something? Do you want to laugh? Say hello? No? He's looking at the computer lights. How cute are you though? Okay. We're going to have to teach now. We'll try one more time. Can you give me a smile? A laugh? Alright. Say goodbye. Hope you guys learnt a lot. He's very vocal, as you can see. DJ Paddy Mills out. Okay, bye. Alright. You'll probably never get a better intro to a lesson than that, so lap that up while you can. What we're looking at today is ATSE and the justice system. So this is lesson 7 in our course booklet. Don't forget to go up to your contents page, highlight it, tick it off. We're on page 33 today. Date it, and here we go. How juicy is this big boy book? So big. If I go like this and sneakily show you the word count, you guys complain about writing 4,000 words to the pip. This is what I put in for your course booklet. Anyway. Alright, so ATSE in the justice system. So at the start of each SVR lesson, we will do what's called a recap question. Because you guys have already looked at SVRs as a whole, this question is looking at revising and you telling me why this certain, in this case we're doing the justice system, so why is the justice system an important SVR and which human right does it relate to? Now, to cap off the start of every recap, all SVRs are important because they increase social mobility, social inclusion, social cohesion. They're your three trifectas: cohesion, mobility, inclusion. They're the good things. But it's also important because of a fourth reason, and that links to the second part of the question, which is that it's a human right. So if you go back up to your SVR infographs that look super duper schmick, on page 19, I believe, yes? Well, here you have the SVR, but then here you've got which human right it relates to. So if we look at the justice system, Article 7 is looking at that all are equal before the law and are entitled, without any discrimination, could highlight that, without any discrimination, to equal protection of the law, which we know doesn't happen. All are entitled to equal protection against any discrimination in violation of this declaration. So that's why you'll see, I know you've seen in shows where they read Miranda rights and they say something to the effect of, if you don't have an attorney, one will be provided to you. Or the idea that in Australia, if you are convicted of a crime, if you don't pay or afford for your own one, you get appointed a state barrister or lawyer. Now, typically they're not the most high caliber of barristers or lawyers out there, but under that human right, you will get access to legal representation. And the idea is that it's equal and without discrimination. Now, I'm going to shatter that myth because if you're an Aboriginal Australian, it's definitely not equal, and it's most definitely systemic discrimination here. So when we're talking about why it's important, your answer here every week should include something like social mobility, social cohesion, social inclusion, even improved life outcomes in the life course, and also something about the compulsory human right in which it relates to. Okay, so here it's Article 7. Bit of an overview on the justice system. So contact with criminal justice system represents a symptom of the broader social and economic disadvantage faced by Aboriginal people in Australia. So whenever there's contact with the justice system, and why it's a lot higher, it's typically because of a lack of access to other SVRs. So for instance, education. Aboriginal students falling out of education earlier. You can see that life cycle of not being as educated, people who don't have a higher education are less likely to have a job. Those people that don't have a job are less likely to engage in more what we would call social deviant behaviour, which means they're less likely to, or more likely, to land up, I guess, in a bit of trouble. And then that's when they contact and face the justice system. So you can see there's 4 or 5 steps before it even gets to this point, and that's only one facet of many. So this is very much a symptom of a broader issue when we're looking at the social justice disparity, but it's still an SVR and it's still important nonetheless. So we've reached a point where intergenerational family dysfunction in many Indigenous communities with problems of domestic violence, alcohol, drug abuse, inadequate housing, poor health and school attendance, a lack of jobs and employment impacting on the next generation of people. Now, this is what I was talking about, how it's 4 or 5 steps before it gets to the justice system, but due to these reasons, there is more likely to be contact with the justice system. If we take domestic violence, alcohol, drug abuse, for example, kids growing up in an environment like that are more likely to be handled into family and community services, where you have things like foster homes, social housing, and in places where children are getting dispossessed again. That's what they call the second stolen generation. But you can see that all contacts with the justice system. So when we're talking about this, it's important to recognise that intergenerational family dysfunction and trauma, and this stems from, if you want to do a little arrow here, from a few things, namely invasion in 1788, stolen generations in 1948, and then the ongoing trauma as a result of those two things throughout history. And there's many others, there's the genocide and massacres, which we'll get into later. But all of this trauma puts you at odds in terms of your life chances. So you're more likely to be involved in the justice system in that regard. Additionally, there's been a loss of cultural knowledge in many Aboriginal communities, and what that has done, I'd even highlight this one, this has disrupted values, norms, and appropriate social behaviour from being transferred from one generation to the next. So especially if we look at, for example, we looked at last lesson that most of Aboriginal law, LORE, LAW, both of those types of law, comes from an oral tradition or oral history. When you have a situation where almost 90% of the population is wiped out, which we'll get to a bit later, you lose all that history, you lose that culture, you lose the values and norms and traditional teachings that would have de-escalated a lot of that social behaviour, and that transfer of knowledge just didn't happen. So you end up with multiple generations of Aboriginal people lost, without guidance, without people to turn to, living in a world which is vastly different from the one they used to live in, which had different laws, which had different systems and different values. So you can see how the run-ins with a British version and very Western cultural version of a justice system, which is in stark contrast to what it was prior to 1788. That's part of the issue there too. Now, in looking at how Aboriginal people face social exclusion within the justice system, one of the big areas is systemic racism, and we look at a royal commission into the Aboriginal deaths report in 1987 as evidence for this. So, quick recap of what a royal commission is a huge investigation, an independent investigation. Usually governments call for it, but if a government calls for a royal commission into a particular area, so say for example Aboriginal deaths in custody, it means that they put together a huge independent panel of experts of that field, and they do a really deep investigation into the reasons behind why something is happening. So there was a royal commission, or a really big investigation into Aboriginal deaths in 1987 in custody within the justice system, because there was a mounting pile of evidence, here we go, suggesting that systemic racism exists, and there was a lot of disparity between how authorities were treating Aboriginal Australians versus how they were treating non-Aboriginal Australians. This was qualitatively reported in terms of eyewitness accounts, interviews, and that sort of thing, as well as the quantitative data which showed a lot of issues that, say, Aboriginal Inmates were more likely to die of random causes. They were more likely to be malnourished. They were more likely to be in solitary confinement for longer periods of time. So all of that quantitative data supported the need for that Royal Commission there as well. So the police misuse of power really increased during the 80s against Aboriginal Australians, and that's when the Royal Commission was established. And this is what it concluded. The immediate causes of death do not include foul play, in the sense of unlawful, deliberate killing of Aboriginal prisoners by police and prisoners' officers. More than 1/3 of the deaths were from disease, 30 were from self-inflicted hangings, 23 were caused by other forms of external trauma, especially head injuries, so you can see like inmates farting and stuff like that, and 9 were immediately associated with dangerous alcohol and other drug use. So I'll just pause it here. So the first finding was that it's not the police's fault and it's not the prison guards' fault, because their cause of death wasn't at the hands of police or prison officers. They were things like self-inflicted hangings, disease, etc. But I think what that fails to recognise is the impact that we look at, I guess, those hidden things, like in terms of how they were treated. Is that making them more likely to want to have a self-inflicted hanging? Are they more likely to get that disease because they're malnourished and not getting fed properly in jail? You know, are they more likely to get external trauma and head injuries from other inmates because security guards aren't, watching and supervising them? Like, do you know what I mean? So I think that you need to take with a bit of grain of salt the fact that they're saying it doesn't include foul play, because most of the deaths were from these reasons. Read between the lines a little bit here. However, there is a bit more here. Indeed, heavy alcohol use was involved in some ways in deaths in each of these categories. The chapter concludes that glaring deficiencies existed in the standard of care afforded to many of the deceased. Okay? There appeared to be, highlight this, little appreciation of and less dedication to the duty of care owed by custodial authorities and their offers to persons in custody. So they recognised at least that there was less appreciation and dedication to duty of care when there was a prisoner with some form of Aboriginality. We found many systems defects in relation to care, and many failures to exercise proper care, and in general a poor standard of care where death was contributed to by system failures or an absence of due care. So, beating around the bush, they said in general their standard of care was much lower, and that's not a good thing, but they said in terms of answering the question, no, it's not our fault, or it's not the prison inmates or the police officers' fault that more people are dying that are of Aboriginal descent in jail. Just that there are glaring deficiencies in all their standards of care. So take of that what you will. To me, as I said earlier, I think there's a lot of hidden stuff there. So I guess that's data here, and qualitative data here, that deaths in custody and treatment in custody for Aboriginal people to non-Aboriginal people there's a huge disproportionate level there. If we look more into quantitative data now, this is very much qualitative, or mostly. The justice system so that we're looking at social inclusion and exclusion currently in contemporary society, looking at the here and now. The justice system has contributed to social exclusion for Indigenous Australians who account for 30%. That's the actual number. That's from 2019. They do these stats every 3 or 4 years, so I've got the most recent that I have available to me. Who account for 30% of all prisoners, although they represent only 3% of the population. This means, get this, Indigenous Australians are 10 times more likely to be incarcerated. So highlight that. 10 times more likely to be incarcerated just for being born Aboriginal. That's a massive statistic there. It's huge. So there's 12,000 Indigenous prisoners and roughly 30,000 non-Indigenous. So for juvenile Aboriginal Australians, though, it gets worse. So people your age, guys, they account for 57% of all prisoners in juvenile justice systems. So meaning they are 24 times more likely than non-Indigenous to be sent to juvie. And if you look at the Northern Territory, it goes even higher, 43 times more likely. That's absurd. That's absolutely mind-boggling. That statistic is massive. Like I said earlier, an Aboriginal person of your age is more likely still to go to jail than to finish year 12. It's it's bad. So that's a data comparison there, or quantitative data we can look at, which gives us evidence here. There are 474 Indigenous deaths in custody for Aboriginal people, which makes them 6 times more likely to die in custody than non-Indigenous. So you're already 10 times more likely, or 24 or 43 times more likely, and then while you're in there, you're then 6 times more likely to die while you're in custody. So you can see, this is what I'm talking about, deep social exclusion. Across every measure you look at, the gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Police and prisons being twice as likely to fail to adhere to procedures in cases involving Aboriginal deaths, 43% compared to non-Indigenous Australians. So The Guardian, again, just highlight this. So The Guardian found, as part of their study into it, that's almost half. So almost half of any procedure relating to an Aboriginal person dying in custody, almost half of the procedures weren't followed properly. They were failed. Compare that to 20%, which is still really bad for non-Indigenous people. That's 1 in 5 versus almost 1 in 2. Okay? So you're more than twice as likely. So you're more likely to go to jail in the first place. You are then 6 times more likely to die in custody. And then if you do, you are 2 times more likely not to receive appropriate care. It's just mind-boggling. And then our second last one is that Aboriginal Australian prisoners, they are 11 times more likely to be denied bail compared to non-Indigenous. So that's in the court system so bail is where you, if you meet certain conditions, you're allowed to reduce your prison sentence, or if it's a minor crime, you can get, someone can pay your sentence out so you don't actually have to go to jail. So you're more likely to be denied that if you're Aboriginal Australian. And then lastly, male Aboriginal prisoners are 3 times more likely not to receive medical care before death compared to non-Indigenous. And for Aboriginal women, this increased to 54% not receiving medical care. So if you're an Aboriginal woman in a prison, you are more than likely, so a majority, more than half, to not receive medical care. And if you're male, you're 3 times more likely not to receive it before death at 36%. So all of these statistics really, to me, across every metric, highlights the disproportionate social exclusion that people face in the justice system if they are Aboriginal. What we're going to do, and we're going to do this in class, so don't worry about it now, we will be watching a documentary called Australia's Shame. It's about ABC's Four Corners. They did a massive report into juvenile justice detention centres in the Northern Territory, where you're 43 times more likely as an Aboriginal person to go to jail there in that country, in that part of our country, sorry. And we'll watch this in class. It goes for 15 minutes, but it will shock you. It's quite appalling. This really looks at and extends on the treatment and the sort of things that we see here, but it also brings, I guess, a face to these statistics. So we'll watch that together. The last thing I want you to look at here is, in every section, I do a little table here that looks at the implications in relation to life chances for ATSI, because if we look at our syllabus, this is the part we're doing currently. If I can highlight it. So these are all the SVRs we're looking at. And there it is. So we are looking at social inclusion and exclusion for one of the following groups. So ours is a different racial or ethnic group, Aboriginal Australians, in relation to access of each of these resources. Okay, so we're looking at the justice system today, and part of that is to look at the implications of access for this group in relation to life chances for its members. So I've linked this into each SVR so that we're kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone in that regard. So we're looking always at the justice system's implications for life chances. We then look at the implications for life chances here. Now, I always start on the human rights abuse that it is, because in any question you get in your HSC on the SVR, you should always be linking and referencing the human rights as part of the social exclusion. Okay, it's a human right, therefore it's an issue. Always can get a appeal paragraph out of that. That's why it's important to know which number they are as well. So, Human Rights Article 7, no group shall be unduly targeted by police or law enforcement. Okay, this is simply false. Look at all this data here, we have to back it up. So the disproportionate quantitative evidence that we have on incarceration of ATSI people, this really does demonstrate the unequal application of law, and really does highlight the institutionalized racism and discrimination placed towards them. So that's an implication in regards to their life chances. Okay, one, that's not good. So they, more than 57% of youth go to jail if you're Aboriginal Australian. So crazy. Or some kind of juvenile detention centre. So that in itself is an implication for their life chances. Okay. And here we can see you can link other SVRs into. So because they're in juvie, there's a problem here with education. So juvenile, like if you're in juvie, you're not going to get a good education as if you're at school. So juveniles in detention centres typically have poorer education, and we know, remember that reading we looked at a couple of lessons ago in relation to your life chances from finishing year 12 even compared to finishing year 11. It was, what was it again? It was, I think you're 5 times more likely to face social exclusion or deep exclusion if you didn't finish year 12. If you add on to that the fact that you're in juvenile detention as well, you can see how that gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. That's when we talk about equality, how it's not great because everyone's starting position is different. Yours is down here, a non-Indigenous person's is up here, Indigenous person's down here. Add the fact that you're in juvenile detention as well. So because you don't have that education, that increases your likelihood of a poorer paying job. Because one, you've got a criminal record, so no one's going to want to hire you. 2, you don't have the education to attain higher qualifications or degree. It also increases your chances of reincarnation. People that go to juvie or jail are significantly more likely to get reincarcerated. And it also creates an unskilled workforce, which then decreases their chance for social mobility and future employment because of that stigma behind being caught up in the justice system and the cycle that you get caught up in of entering and re-entering there. Because you can see how that can work. You go to juvie, you get a criminal record, you go out, no one wants to hire you for any jobs. People steer clear of you. People's opinion of you is really degraded, and so you feel isolated. People who feel socially isolated tend to go to coping mechanisms. What's your number one coping mechanism? Drugs, alcohol, abuse. You can see how that cycle is just so savage, it's severe, it's heinous. And so when we're looking at that, that's definitely a social implication on their life course there. Another one I put here is healthcare. So we look at incarceration rates. We looked at this stat here, 30 deaths inflicted to self-inflicted hangings. What does that tell you about mental health? So incarceration increases your risk of depression, suicide and self-harm. It leads to poor emotional development because you are surrounded by other criminals and other, delinquents, you could say. And so the people you hang out with inform your future decisions. So you have that side of things as well. Again, no education outcomes. You put further fractures on family relationships. All of these things are severe, long-term, and often irreversible. So that's a really big implication to the life chances for Aboriginal Australians there as well. And furthermore, ATSI prisoners and youth in detentions, as we will watch with Australia's shame, are victims of abuse from prison guards themselves. And what that does is that creates significant potential for even further mental health issues, PTSD, one amongst many there. So that's a really big, recap, a lot of the implications in relation to life chances. Now, at the end of each of these, I've left a little bit of a gap in most areas, and that's for you to add any more social implications that you can think of. Now, I would really encourage you guys to add 1 or 2 to each of these as I do your summaries. I've left it open and blank there for an example. I think there's so much data here that I've kind of looked at here with you, and you are in the best position to be able to know which part of the evidence stands out to you. And so if you're able to write your own examples, when you do your own pure paragraphs and essay questions like we have here, you're more likely to write effectively. So I've got a 1-page peel here for us. Now it is a higher order verb for a 5 marker, I know, but we'll see how you go. You may only get through 1 peel here because it's quite detailed, but if you can get through 2, that's even better. If this is not enough space for you, continue the answer in your big boy book. So question is, assess how the justice system impacts the life course of one group in one country you have studied. So we know assess means to make a judgment, saying the positive and negative impacts. Now, when we're looking at the justice system impacting the life course of Aboriginal Australians, there are no positive impacts, so it's okay to have a double whammy on 2 negatives as long as you're making that assessment. Okay. So assessing how the justice system impacts, so it negatively impacts, hint hint, the life course of one group, Aboriginal Australians, in one country, Australia, that you've studied. So 2 pure paragraphs on that. You've got tons of data and info that you can use here. Complete that, and we'll look at peer marking that in class together on the Friday. That's it from me. I'll see you in the next one.